So let's jump along here, guys, and let's talk about some interesting stuff. One of the reasons that I always fell in love with sports, for me, was that sports to me wasn't just about the players. It was about the stories, and the stories that were intertwined, not only in the drama of what was happening on the field, but the numbers that came along with it. So going back to my younger days, I was such a statistical nerd. Like, I used to sit outside during baseball season, and this is, I don't want anybody to laugh, but this is how old I am. I would listen to the game on the radio, and I would have a score sheet. I would have a book where I could listen to all the games, and I could write down what was happening in the game. So if somebody hit a single, a double, a triple, you would just keep track of everybody. And then at the end of the year, I would compile my own stats, and I would compare them to the stats that I would find in the newspaper to see how close I was. And I realized that's incredibly nerdy. But again, I was a sports nerd, and I still think I am. So things like this, I always find to be incredibly entertaining to me. So I'm going to go through a list right now of who the league leaders were and things that they did. And we'll compare the story that we heard all year long compared to what the reality of it is. So, for example, the league leader in passing touchdowns this year. Now, the league leader in passing touchdowns in the first 5 weeks was Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson was on a pace to score 60 touchdowns. This guy was on fire, in fuego. Well, Russell obviously ran into some problems along the way. He did finish with 40 touchdowns, which is still a very, very impressive year, but it didn't match his beginning part of the year. Tom Brady, a lot of people thought Tom Brady was washed up midseason. You know, you would hear people say, is it time for Tom Brady to retire? Did he make a mistake going to Tampa Bay? Well, Tom Brady actually also threw for 40 touchdowns, and that's impressive. So the guy that a lot of people were talking about, saying that he's a shoo-in for MVP, and I've disagreed along the way, Patrick Mahomes. Now, I'm not, again, I think I need to explain this to people. I'm not tearing down Patrick Mahomes as a talent. He is obviously an incredibly talented NFL quarterback who's unstoppable in moments. But Patrick Mahomes only, and I use that word loosely here, Patrick Mahomes only had 38 touchdowns this year. So Patrick Mahomes wasn't even in the top 3 guys. So who was number 1? Well, the man that I've been saying should be MVP, who's probably had the quietest 48 touchdown season of all time. We're talking about Mr. Aaron Rodgers of the Packers. 48 touchdowns, led the NFL. And by the way, as a side note, Josh Allen had 37 touchdowns, which is super, super impressive. Let's talk about yardage. So if it wasn't for Patrick Mahomes actually sitting out the last game of the year, he would have led the league in yardage, for sure. He finishes with 4,740 yards, a lot of yards. Tom Brady was right behind him, 4,633 yards. So again, you're looking at Tom Brady and you're saying, this guy's washed up. Well, he's second in the league in touchdowns, third in the league in yards thrown for. I mean, a great season by Tom Brady, but number 1 on the list for quarterbacks who threw for the most yardage, Watson from Texas. Deshaun Watson, 4,823 yards. Impressive indeed. Now, this is one of those stats that to me is mind-blowing. Back in the 70s, even the 80s, if a quarterback would complete 60% of his passes, people were like, wow, this is amazing. 60% of his passes is so amazing. Well, this year, we had not 1, not 2, but 3 quarterbacks play an entire season and all pass for over 70% completion. 70% completion. And 2 other guys were very close. Teddy Bridgewater was 69%, 69.1. Josh Allen for the Bills, 69.2%. We had 3 guys at 70% of their passes. That means 7 out of every 10 passes they throw were completed. We're talking about Deshaun Watson at 70.2%. Drew Brees, 70.5%. And again, the man who I said is MVP, Aaron Rodgers, 70.7% of his passes completed. Absolutely amazing. You think in a game right now that is so focused on throwing the ball, that the running backs are probably, no one's got a lot of yards, right? Well, you'd be kind of right. In years past, I've seen a lot bigger numbers from a lot more guys. But the guys who were successful were extremely successful. Number 1 was obviously Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry broke the 2,000-yard mark. He's one of only 8 players to ever do it in the entire history of the NFL. Now, years ago, that was something that almost seemed untouchable. Eric Dickerson actually has the record, and I believe it's 2,120 yards. I read a report over the weekend saying that Mr. Dickerson was actually afraid that the Texans game was going to go into overtime, the Texans-Titans game, and that Derrick Henry was going to get a shot at actually breaking his record. So he was sweating it out a little bit. Derrick Henry, number one, at 2,027 yards. Number two, a guy who had another fantastic year, Cook from the Minnesota, 1,557 yards. That's a great year. There's a huge fall off after that, though. Now, Jonathan Taylor had the best year of any rookie running back. He had 1,169 yards. But to put that in perspective, Taylor finished his year with over 200 yards in the last game. So if it wasn't for the last game of just an amazing wrap up to a season, Taylor wouldn't have hit that 1,000-yard mark. Aaron Jones had 1,100 yards. David Montgomery had 1,000 yards. And James Robinson, who's another rookie, also had 1,000 yards. Only 6 players had over 1,000 yards this year, which is very rare for an NFL season. But that's kind of because we throw the ball so much now, but it's also because of the running back by committee thing that you see. Scoring touchdowns by running backs, just running the ball into the end zone. Derrick Henry led the way with 17 touchdowns. Cook, 16. Alvin Kamara with 16. Putting that in perspective, though, Kamara had 6 in one game. So without that huge game, he still would have had 10. Nick Chubb had 12. Cam Newton had 12, showing some value on the ground. Too bad he can't throw the ball. And Josh Jacobs, he of the most recent DUI story, also had 12. Receiving yards. I've said all year long that I don't think that there are alpha receivers anymore. There are some, but not too many. So you're not seeing guys that are having these huge, enormous years that we saw in years past. But there are a few. Number one, Stephon Diggs goes to the Buffalo Bills, and what people were calling like a weird draft day trade. Diggs scores gets 1,535 yards. I mean, absolutely impressive. That's a huge year for Diggs. Diggs actually was traded, and the Vikings drafted Jefferson. Jefferson actually got 1,400 yards. So when you look at that as an even for even trade, the Vikings trade Diggs away. They get a first round draft pick. I think they get a first and a third. They end up getting Jefferson with that first round pick. They pay a lot less. Diggs is happy in Buffalo. Jefferson and the Minnesota are happy together. That's pretty much a trade 1-for-1. Number 2 on the list, though, and I've never seen this before. Number 2 on the list of receiving yards for the year was, we have a girl who works for us, a woman who works for us named Lovely, and Lovely happens to love Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce was number 2. So if Stephon Diggs doesn't have that huge last game that he had, which, he only played a half of football, but it's an amazing last game. Travis Kelce would have led the league in receiving yards as a tight end. That's amazing. Also on the list worth mentioning, DeAndre Hopkins, 1,407 yards. Devontae Adams with 1,375 yards. And Calvin Ridley with 1,374 yards. Amazing. Let's talk about actual receptions. Stephon Diggs again, 127 receptions. I mean, he was targeted over 175 times this year. That is a phenomenal number. Closest guy to him was Hopkins in Arizona with 115. Then you got Adams with 115. Darren Waller with 107. Travis Kelce with 105. So out of the top 5 receivers in receptions this year, 2 were tight ends. You're seeing a lot of trends. Pay attention to them for next year when you're drafting your fantasy teams. Touchdowns this year. Number 1 with a bullet. It was the third most touchdowns by a receiver in NFL history, coming behind Randy Moss, who had 23 one year, and Jerry Rice, who had 22 one year. Devontae Adams had 18 touchdowns this year. He missed 2 games and a half of another game. That's how good Devontae Adams was this year. Absolutely lethal. Total yards from scrimmage. Derrick Henry, of course, 2,141 yards. Derrick Henry had like 120 yards receiving all year long. That's incredible to me that they don't get the ball in his hands in the open space. That's just amazing. Let's talk about sacks. Let's talk about my guy in Pittsburgh. I don't actually remember a time when any Pittsburgh Steeler has led the league in sacks, but it happened this year. TJ Watt, 15 total sacks this year. Behind him, Aaron Donald with 13.5, and a couple of other guys with 13, 12. Not a lot of sacks this year for how much they throw the ball. Not a lot of individual sacks. So it wasn't a huge year for sack masters this year. TJ Watt definitely made himself some money. And by the way, for the first time in history, the Pittsburgh Steelers led the league in sacks for the 4 years in a row. This year, they led the league with 56 sacks. Last thing we'll talk about is interceptions. And this is a guy who didn't get a lot of talk, actually. Xavier Howard led the NFL with 10 interceptions. I mean, that's amazing. Double-digit interceptions for the first time since anybody's had that since 2007. I mean, that's a player. And that was why I was so high on the Dolphins and why I was so disappointed in their very last game. That secondary was really, really good. C.J. Jackson came up short of what Xavier had, but he still had 9. That's just incredible. I don't even know who J.C. Jackson is. I said his name wrong the first time. Unbelievable, actually. So those are the stats for the year. And when you see those stats, you start to think to yourself, wow, just what exactly do those stats really mean? Well, they mean a lot of things. First of all, that it's props to everybody who was able to have these amazing stats. It probably got you to the Pro Bowl. It might make you an All-Pro. All of these things can trigger some things in certain people's contracts so they can make more money. It also gives people leverage later on when they go to negotiate their contract. Imagine going to work every day and saying to your boss, hey, I can actually show you with numbers how much value I have to your company. Well, that's what these guys can do when it's time to renegotiate those contracts. So those are all interesting things. Also, it puts a lot of people in a position to be able to say that I'm due for some type of award. Well, speaking of awards, I've got a guy coming to join me on the show right now.